Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I'm the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Authors Series event and World Affairs Today program. Throughout history, numerous cities have served as global capitals, where trade, culture, and political power crossed and were anchored. Those who lived in these cities were seen as being at the center of power and politics. They became destination places for those who wished to gain and exercise influence. Washington, D.C. took on that mantle in the post-World War II decades. In that time period, advances in technology and infrastructure have made the world a much smaller place. Traveling across the globe can take less than 24 hours instead of days or weeks. Messages are transmitted around the world and back in a matter of seconds. Location seems less and less important when you can Skype a meeting in a foreign country. As we become more globalized and interconnected, what does a global city mean? Is it still the seat of international power once associated with it? To discuss with us this concept of a global city is Dr. Kent Calder, author of Asia and Washington, Exploring the Penumbra of Transnational Power. Dr. Calder not only analyzes the concept of a global city, but can see its definition and nuance played out in the progression of Washington, D.C., and engagement by Asian countries. Dr. Calder is the director of the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies. He is the former special advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and has been a professor at Princeton University for 20 years. He also served as a researcher with the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, and in his youth lived in Southeast Asia while his father worked with the Ford Foundation on development projects. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Calder.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. The World Affairs Council is both one of my favorite organizations in Washington, and I think something tremendously important as we think about where the world is, and Washington also, are moving today. I started coming to Washington longer ago than I like to think. The years have gone awfully fast. But it was right in the latter days of the Vietnam War. I worked on Capitol Hill. Over the years, I kept coming back as executive director of Harvard's U.S.-Japan program, then during my days at Princeton at 2.5 hours on the train. But I was away enough that I could begin to see Washington changing. After the time in Princeton, I spent a few years in Tokyo with the U.S. Embassy as an advisor to Ambassadors Mondale and Foley, and then came back again to Princeton and back here to Washington in the last 11 years at SAIS Johns Hopkins. So over the years, I've seen Washington changing, but I've been detached enough that I've been, I think, able to see the profile of that change. I hope that's the case to some degree, which really was what brought me to write this book. It's a book about two things: about how Washington is changing, and then about how the key nations of Asia are responding to that change. And I'd like to tell you today something about what I have found. I start with the notion of a global political city, a city that has a worldwide meaning, Washington is not the only one. Some of the other cities that you can see there on the map, of course, are included within them. And I think you can differentiate cities, major global cities, in two dimensions. On the left, their global political influence. On the top, their role as a global economic center. Washington, of course, as you can see, is the furthest to the left. Clearly the most important global political city in the world. I think we would all agree. But by no means the only one. Beijing, of course, is moving into that role as the influence of China rises. There are some smaller nations whose capitals actually are important as global political cities too. You'll notice, for example, Brussels, a small country, but a large, increasingly important city in world affairs because of the role of the organizations based there. NATO is in Brussels. The European Union is in Brussels. So gradually, Brussels is coming to have some of the characteristics that Washington has, particularly a very dynamic sector of NGOs and international organizations outside the government itself. So we can divide, I think, cities worldwide in terms of their economic functions and their political functions, with Washington being very much of a political city. But we can also see their changes over time. As you can see, Washington in 1920, right after World War I, was a city where the size of the government really wasn't very large. Up until World War II, actually, we had the State Department, the Defense Department, more or less all of our foreign policy establishment in one building. As many of you know, the old Executive Office building, right next to the West Wing of the White House, where President Obama has his office today. So our government, the government, began to expand greatly after World War II. And you can see, well, I think it's fair to say, particularly, of course, our defense intelligence side of the government, right through the end of the Cold War. Since then, particularly, we've seen this big shift up and to the right. That is to say, particularly the role of NGOs, of multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, so that Washington is not only capital of the United States, it's also, of course, a very important city for a broader agenda setting, not only for America, but for the world as a whole, as we see on the human rights question, for example, or issues of foreign aid or international finance. Now, how has Washington been changing? I'd like to say just a few words about that. Well, one of the most important developments has been, of course, we're becoming more cosmopolitan. Our population of foreign-born citizens today is about 3 times what it was in 1970, so just 2 generations ago. Part of that is the embassies. We're up from less than 100 to roughly double that in terms of the numbers, with the big expansion in the 1960s as many African countries became independent, and in the 1990s as the Soviet Union broke up, were 2 of those big changes. But of course also NGOs, all sorts of other organizations, or people who are just working here and visiting fellows, and a wide range of functions. So we're becoming more cosmopolitan. What I call the Penumbra of Power, the area on a dark night, of course, and when we see an eclipse, the moon is in the center and around the edges. That shadowy portion around the moon, the moon at night, is really the analogy that I'm drawing. I wouldn't say that they're totally shadowy. I mean, many of us know lobbyists, we know law firms. Some of us are working in the NGO community or in some of the organizations that you see here on this chart. But what I'm saying is this part of Washington that we have right around us here, close to DuPont Circle, is becoming increasingly important. And that is the cutting edge of the globalization of Washington itself. World Affairs Council members, of course, many of them are exactly in that community. I talk in the book about the way some of these different parts of the Penumbra of Power are changing. One of the interesting ones is the consulting and law firms and PR firms. I think those three concepts are beginning to merge. There's quite a bit of consolidation going on. Things like Stonebridge Albright, the consulting firm which Secretary of State Madeleine Albright helped to found and does lead now, and close relationships with a variety of law firms as well. And so you're getting a much more kind of comprehensive and a larger scale and global scale of agenda-setting capabilities that often involve major former policymakers. They might involve people who have technical skills like lawyers, and then the public relations people as well. And they're setting an agenda, say, for the Millennium Challenge or the ODA, where our development assistance should be allocated, or what kind of policies we need in the Middle East, or the role of sanctions, or the comfort women issue, or a range of issues in a very diverse area, set of categories, with, of course, the nature of the debate that's going on here in Washington magnified by the coming of the internet, by podcasting, and so on. So this group around the, not in the government, but in some ways of the government, many of them people who have previously been in government service and who know the problems that the government faces, but yet are outside the government. Those functions and those people, I think, are becoming increasingly important in the Washington that's emerging. I talk in some detail also about what something that really interested me, the geography of Washington's information complex. Here, I know it's a little bit hard to read, but I plotted out the locations of some of the key institutions in Washington's idea industry, and I found that they concentrate geographically to a degree that really surprised me. You can see, for example, the multilateral organizations down in the southern part of town, around F Street and around there, the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank. They're not U.S. government institutions, but of course they interact every day with the Treasury, the White House, and all of these other institutions. You've got K Street lobbyists. K Street, of course, is traditionally where the law firms that also work with Capitol Hill have been located since the 1930s. But the one interesting finding that I had was that the locus, if you will, of the really intense interactions that had some relationship to policy in Washington, I think is beginning to shift. It was from the 1930s to probably a decade or so ago, focused on K Street. But the area around Massachusetts Avenue, exactly where we are now, I think is becoming increasingly important. And you can see perhaps part of the reason we have DuPont Circle here down to Scott Circle, Massachusetts Avenue. And the circle which cuts across all of the others on this chart, if I know it's complicated and hard to read, is the think tanks. The think tanks cut geographically across most of the other important sort of circles of non-governmental Washington. And in many ways, actually, they link these, both in terms of human relations. People eat in the same restaurants, they pass by each other on the street, their offices are close to each other. So there's a social community among each of these different separate worlds, but the think tanks tend to be overarching around all of these. And they're also the largest and most important think tanks in the world are becoming increasingly concentrated in a very small part of Massachusetts Avenue. A lot of you have seen the building cranes that are up at the corner of about on 18th Street in Mass. American Enterprise Institute is moving in there. It's right next to the Carnegie Endowment, which is right next to the Brookings Institution, which is, by recent polls, has been considered the top think tank in the world. And not far away, over on Rhode Island Avenue, is CSIS, which in the strategic area, of course, is also considered one of the world's most important. So there's something like Silicon Valley or Madison Avenue, which is arising in Washington in the information industry area, is the argument that I'm making. It's what the Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter has called a competitive cluster. That is to say, the very most competitive institutions are head-to-head with one another. And because of the competition, they're driving each other forward. They're making each other more aggressive in some ways, but in some ways also more competitive. Much of what they do could well be superficial. Some parts of it could be controversial. There's been, of course, recently some controversy regarding their role in the media and elsewhere. That said, I think at least the work that I did in Asia and Washington suggested to me that they're becoming, especially in an information age when the issue cycle is so quick, when you need to get podcasting out or you need some expert that you can trot on to CNN in 10 minutes or something like that about some emerging crisis, that those institutions that happen to be in the Washington, Massachusetts Avenue area are becoming more influential, not simply in Washington, but around the world. Now, that's not all that's happening in Washington. Another major change that I found is the post-war emergence of Greater Washington, that is to say, Washington beyond the Beltway. You can see this really began in the 1950s, and it's quite dramatic. The population of Greater Washington is now about 8 million people. The population of Washington, finally, in the last 10 years, it's begun to go up again after a long time that it was declining. But the big growth in Washington has really been, in population terms anyway, has been beyond the Beltway. This shows you geographically what I'm talking about. Out to the northwest of Washington, we have the Dulles Corridor, out to Dulles Airport and beyond. Anybody know what the wealthiest county in the United States is, or where it is? Anybody? That's very close. Montgomery is, I think, number 4 in Maryland, and it's up the other way, up the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Loudoun County, actually, and this changes. There are times that Montgomery has been number 1, number 2. Most recently, in 2013, it was Loudoun County over in Virginia. And Fairfax County, which is on the same line, just a little closer to Washington, was number 2. And then Montgomery County was number 4. So there's an incredible economic growth and substantial degree of affluence that's been emerging in the Beltway around Washington. As a lot of us know, Tyson's Corner in the decade of the 1990s, I believe was the largest, the most rapidly growing sort of middle range city in the United States, just as one example. So, and what do you have in these places? Well, you have some significant degree, as you can see from the map, of the information industry. What you might call a global information complex, which goes far beyond just the United States alone. Of course, a lot of it is U.S. government. We have up the Baltimore-Washington Parkway the U.S. Cyber Command, for example. We have the NSA. We have NASA itself. But there are certainly other parts that are not defense related. The National Institute of Health, for example. Gannett Publications, USA Today, America Online was founded out the Dulles Parkway. So the information revolution that has given us the internet and such a transformation in the technical nature of world affairs originated right here in the Washington area. And that is certainly a development that I think one has to think about in understanding Washington and the responses of other countries. Needless to say, that makes them increasingly interested in Washington, just as the fact that the IMF is located here. The International Monetary Fund is located here. Many of the development banks, a very large office of the Asian Development Bank. So there is a rapid increase in these functions that have a global sort of role. And that's something extremely important, I think, to remember. Now, if we have a changing Washington in the internet age, where people have to respond quickly, and a part of the world that may not be formally the U.S. government, but where developments have global implications, where somebody can make a statement and it'll be heard if Christine Lagarde or some NGO president makes a statement, or in many areas outside sort of geopolitical, on the environment. The World Wildlife Fund, of course, is located here. That these things really are heard around the world. And so, the stakes are high. In thinking about Asia and in Washington, which is the particular subject, I could be talking about Europe in Washington, or Africa in Washington, or Latin America in Washington. I think conceptually the same point exists, that countries have to respond to what happens here, even if the issue is not a direct matter of American policy. Often if it's an issue of human rights or the environment or something like that, it's something where what happens in Washington has quite an importance. Now, in the case of Asia, this is particularly true. As we all know, many of the countries of Asia, including China, of course, are very heavily dependent on trade with the United States. And in China's case, exports are, on the order of over 30% of GDP. And this is true of many of the other nations of Asia as well. So the countries of Asia have a strong stake in what happens here in Washington. Now, in the book, I took 8 countries in Asia, and they are, well, we can, of course, China. China's the largest. That was one of the key ones. I compared the People's Republic of China with another part of China, but of course politically very different, Taiwan. I took pairs of entities, pairs of political entities in Asia, and compared them with each other. I took 4 pairs. One of the pairs was China and Taiwan. Another one was Japan and Korea. Another one was India and Myanmar, or as we often call it, Burma. And the other one was Indonesia and Singapore. In each of the pairs, there was one large country, and there was one that was considerably smaller, to sort of begin to see, what it is that enables a country to get what it wants in international affairs out of Washington. And the interesting finding that I had was that it is not always, I'll talk about this later, it's not always just how big that country happens to be, or how many lobbyists it has, or how big its embassy is, or something like that. Before I talk about that, let me say just a word or two about another factor which is quite important in Asia and Washington. That is the way that our country is changing. As we all know, it's becoming more diverse. But as far as Asia is concerned, the ethnic configuration has changed very strikingly since 1965, when our immigration law was changed. Back in '65, this line here is the number of Chinese Americans in the United States. This line here is the number of Japanese Americans. And there are other trends which are not such dramatic changes, but there's been a real significant change. Now, in 1965, the number of Japanese Americans was double the number of Chinese Americans. Today, the number of Chinese Americans is 4 times as large as the number of Japanese Americans. So that's the most dramatic shift. But along all of these lines, of course, we do have a much more diverse population, and a larger number of citizens from other countries than used to be true. Now, they are traditionally, Asian American population has been concentrated out here on the West Coast, particularly in Hawaii, with the largest population, 54% by the last census was Asian American in general, with particularly a very large share of Japanese Americans there. Of course, Senator Inoue has passed away, but Senator Mazie Hirono, elected recently, the only foreign-born senator in the United States, who was born in Fukushima, Japan, as one example. Japanese American population is large, and political influence is large in Hawaii. On the West Coast, particularly in California, of course, there's a substantial Japanese or Asian American population. And it's also, of course, the largest state in the country in population terms, 13.8% by our latest census. Also here in this area, as we know, in the state of Virginia, there's a substantial number of Korean Americans. In Maryland, in New Jersey, in New York State, particularly in this part of the country. And at the margin, there have also been some relatively rapid changes that have been occurring, particularly, and I thought this was interesting, in the southern part of the United States, where in the last decade, the number of Asian Americans has risen by a little more than 40%. Also in the South, 13 states of the South, 2 of the governors are Asian American, both of them Nikki Haley in South Carolina and then Bobby Jindal in Louisiana. So there have been some important changes in the role beyond the beltway of Asian Americans in U.S. politics, but it's been particular parts of Asia that are represented in that sense. Of course, they're all American citizens with their roots here, but their background of origin is somewhat different in that regard. And it's a question as to what kind of impact that is having on American politics and also on trans-Pacific relations. Now, the next issue that I went to was the question of explaining the influence that Asian nations have. Of course, America is tremendously important to almost all of the nations of Asia. But the influence which they have seems to be, in some interesting ways, substantially different. Let me show you some dramatic examples. Addresses to joint meetings of Congress. This isn't joint sessions of Congress, because, of course, that's when the president appears for the State of the Union address. But since 1970, I took an analysis of what just used Israel as a control. Of course, Israel is outside of Asia, and of course, a number of Israeli leaders have spoken to our Congress, that is both the House and the Senate together. But apart from that, one interesting finding was that every Korean president since democratization in the late 1980s, except one, President Roh Moo-hyun, has spoken to a joint meeting of Congress. And, four prime ministers of India, 3 prime ministers of the Philippines, and so on. But actually, there's not been any prime ministers of Japan, leaders of Taiwan, or leaders of China who have spoken. That's just, I don't want to attribute too much significance to that. Of course, Japan is a valued ally. I think anyone who's involved in the field certainly would say that that's the case. But it's an interesting data point that is interesting to examine and that I looked at in the book. Every nation of Asia has had some major successes in dealings with Washington, but the successes have been somewhat different in their nature. There are 2 free trade agreements between the U.S. and Asian countries. One of them is the Chorus Free Trade Agreement between South Korea and the United States, concluded in 2012. The other one is Singapore's Free Trade Agreement, which was the first with the United States in 2002. And there are many other things that it would take time to go into, but I did find, interestingly enough, that it seems the FTA is just one indicator that those 2 countries, Singapore, much smaller than Indonesia that I compared it with, and of course very small, only 5 million people, has been quite successful in Washington, and also in many ways South Korea has. Now, what is it that explains who does better and who doesn't do as well in Washington, D.C.? Well, I looked at these 5 factors. I think, and this is just to sort of an overview of them. I think classically, the so-called classical realist, that is to say, how big is the country? How large is its military? How large is its population? You know, classically in international relations, those are the things people have pointed to as determining influence. Another possibility, I thought, classical diplomacy. How good is their Secretary of State? Do they have another Henry Kissinger or another Madeleine Albright or whomever you would want to choose? Or how large is their embassy? How many diplomats do they have at work? What does that tell us? Another one that I think is pretty well commonly used is lobbying. How many lobbyists does the country in question have? And actually there's some very interesting data on that. The Foreign Agent Registration Act. Anyone who works directly for a foreign government has to register if that is the primary work that they're doing. Another possibility, what about the people you know? Or what about the public diplomacy, the way that the embassies in question, that the NGOs related to that country, that they reach out? How important is that sort of thing? So those are the kinds of things that I looked at. I think these are the classical arguments here: the size, the diplomats, and the lobbyists. But what I also wanted to look at was the networks people have and the kind of public diplomacy that they do. Well, we know who the big countries are. China and Japan, of course, and India really are the largest. Who has the biggest embassy? This was interested me, and the diplomatic list, as many of you know, provides us data. Every 6 months you can get a list of exactly who is accredited from a given country, and I looked at this over time. China has by far the largest embassy in Washington. There's a big jump down. Japan is second, but it has only a little more than half as many as China. Singapore here has only 20 diplomats. China has almost 200. It's, as you know, it's out in the international, out on Van Ness. It's almost across the street, those two embassies, but one is 10 times the size of the other. Who are the lobbyists? Well, back in 1960, the French had more lobbyists than anybody else in Washington. Since then, things have shifted. Over time, Japan rapidly rose from number 7 in 1960. Since then, it has had the largest number of lobbyists in Washington. But the overall number of lobbyists has fallen, I think you'll see, very sharply. One other point that interested me, the share of lobbyists from Asia in the total is really risen. The Asian countries have become the major lobbyists in Washington. Japan, number 1, Korea, number 2, Taiwan, number 4, China, number 5, and then India, number 10. The only ones apart from that are really up there, there's several, as you can see, from the Middle East as well. Now, as I said, the number of lobbyists in Washington has fallen dramatically. In the late 1980s, Pat Choate wrote a book that became quite well known and to many also rather notorious, called Agents of Influence, about the way that lobbyists are taking over Washington, D.C. Well, the number of lobbyists, at least in the traditional way that lobbyists were presented, has fallen dramatically. As you can see, these are the aggregate, the numbers. This is Japan, is up there at 275 in 1990. But then we noted in the past chart down to 34. Japan is still large, but there's been a huge decline in the number of lobbyists in Washington. So, that was something that I thought was interesting when I wrote this. That said, there's been some shifts, interesting shifts among Japan, China, and Korea in terms of government spending. And again, the Foreign Agent Registration Act can give you figures on all of this by the governments, by the law firms, although relationships with think tanks are not covered under this data. This is Japan, or this is Korea. It's been a mixed picture, but the spending, as far as we can trace it, I have to say, certainly there is much that is not in these figures. I think everyone would agree, but we don't have much better figures than this. And it is one important indicator. So Korea's spending on under the Registration Act has, broadly speaking, has risen. Japan's spending, conversely, has fallen sharply. Now, these figures are through the end of 2012. So, since 2012, late 12, when Prime Minister Abe came to power, it is said that Japan has become much more active in Washington. But the figures here show a sharp change between Korea and Japan. China, according to these figures, has begun to rise. No doubt, this greatly understates spending by China-related organizations, partly because a lot of that spending goes into the media, CCTV. For example, the National Broadcasting Network now has a very large broadcast group in Washington, about 5 times as large as NHK, the Japanese broadcasters, for example. I could say, in the interest of time, won't get into detail. I did some work on ambassadors, what their backgrounds were, their relationship to the U.S., to where they had studied in the U.S. The small countries, broadly speaking, actually have many of the extremely qualified ambassadors, and often ones who have tremendous networks, which I think helps to account partly for why the small countries do relatively well in Washington. So what would I say in conclusion about the work that I did? I thought it was fascinating, I must say, having been around Washington on Capitol Hill, in think tanks, in universities, working for agencies like the Federal Trade Commission for a long time, and then also in the State Department. I was fascinated how much Washington is changing. It absolutely is, as many of you also know from your own experience. It's a very different place now from what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And why is this? Of course, the technological change is a big part of it. Globalization is part of it. The geopolitical change, the end of the Cold War, the opportunity that this is given to a whole group of new actors, for example, China, to be much more involved in international affairs in Washington than was previously true. Technology has, I think, been another major factor. The coming of the internet, it expands the scope, the playing field, if you will, here in Washington. It also privileges institutions that have some money and some savvy, have some ability to do public relations. So the combination of people who have government experience or a reputation of some kind, and then technological change, the coming of podcasting, the coming of YouTube, the importance of the internet, global conferences. All of these things, I think, have magnified the opportunities that institutions like the large think tanks have in Washington, D.C., and also the advantages that they have on a global scale. It's not only the think tanks. The opportunities, I think, are there for NGOs in their area, the World Wildlife Fund, Save the Children, many different organizations that operate, Caritas, relief organizations. Of course, they rely more and more also on the understanding and approval of people throughout the world, Amnesty International. So it's not only governments, and it's not only a geopolitical change, it's a global phenomenon. It affects the world, and it affects Asia. And the people who benefit in the end, I think, are not necessarily the largest players. Of course, in some cases, money and influence and traditional ties matter, particularly if they're combined with the technological capability to convey, people's opinions. But also, the new world of Washington is giving advantages, at the very least, to the smaller countries. One example, as I said, I think is probably Singapore, or to the people who can move rapidly and astutely in a world that's increasingly complex. So those are a few of the things that I found. But every time I talk about this, I find that I learn something new, and I look forward very much to your reactions. Thanks very much.
Okay, my name is Abraham Avidor, retired Foreign Service. Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. And I'd like you to comment also on, in addition to all the positive aspects, also on the negative aspects of Washington, D.C. I'll start with two jokes. One of them is that the only thing which has a point in Washington is the Washington Monument, and that 64,
which we have right here.
Right here, and 64 square miles surrounded by reality. Okay, so more seriously, the negative trends. The traffic is a nightmare. Trying to get around in downtown D.C. Dysfunctional Congress. They cannot pass a legislation, and even if they pass, it's vetoed by the president, and their rating is very low by any measure. Government shutdowns and low morale of government workers. Disparity between the have and the have-nots on the other side of the Anacostia River. These are just a couple of examples, several examples that I think could be mentioned for the sake of completion to all the bright side of D.C. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think you have pointed to some very, very important things, which also, I think, affect the way Washington itself operates, precisely because of the unfortunate logjam that we have on Capitol Hill, and all of the complexity in appointments and the kind of scrutiny that officials get through hearings and so on. The formal side of our government is finding it harder and harder to act. I think that's exactly right. So what that does, I think, is to put more and more influence in the hands of the people who set agendas and create networks outside the government. And traditionally, of course, the lobbyists who had sort of gone from Capitol Hill and worked 20 years on the Foreign Relations Committee staff or the Armed Services staff and went up to K Street, the problems that Congress is having in operating and the lack of budget and so on, I think is making that more difficult. We've, to me, the recent development, Boggs and Blow, the Boggs and Blow law firm, Tommy Boggs, I guess, is retiring, who was one of the great lobbyists of his era of Washington, D.C., symbolizes in some sense that the transition, people did have their roots in Capitol Hill. So Congress can't operate. The links to other parts of town are changing. You mentioned inequality, which certainly I would agree on that one too. I think that's a huge problem for Washington and for our country. I mentioned, some of the out the Beltway, of course, is becoming wealthy, and that there are many areas that don't benefit from that. Well, that's a piece of the overall dynamic, I think, of Washington. And what is happening? Globalization, I think, is differentially benefiting a particular subset of Washington community and particular sorts of institutions. The non-governmental institutions have a lot more flexibility than the governmental, precisely because of the crossfire in Capitol Hill and the difficulties of getting appointments through. The non-governmental side is where a lot of the action are. There's a lot of able people who don't want to take on government positions just because the crossfire is so bad or the regulations are so bad. But if they went to a think tank, if they went to a lobbying firm, in some cases to a university, it's much easier for them to influence not only Capitol Hill or Washington itself, but the world. So I agree with you totally. There are some negatives, but the negatives actually, many of them they're either a product of the positives or they're driving the overall patterns that we have, which I think is really for the penumbra of power, for the non-governmental side to become more and more powerful.
Alicia can't be precise. Looking forward, when we look at the map of the cities that were moving in directions to being transnational centers, if we look forward, let's say 20, 30 years, and particularly looking at the experience of Washington with government gridlock and its lack of flexibility in the information age to make responses, but in this country, because of the nature of our society, we have a vibrant non-governmental sector where the government is not afraid of that sector. But some of the major cities on your list, an example being Beijing, also Moscow, perhaps some in the Arab countries, they would perhaps not be able to substitute the lack of flexibility in the government sector for a vibrant non-governmental sector. So do you have any projections about what would be major centers in 20, 30 years?
That is a very interesting question. I do think that this sort of work on global political cities is something that I hope we'll see more and more of in the future. I think it's quite important as a supplement to our normal ways of looking at international affairs. The first city that I would point to, I think, is Brussels. I think, and again, the interesting thing is it's not the capital of a major nation, with no insult intended to Belgium, but of course it is one of the smaller countries in Europe. But it's getting a group, for example, the International Crisis Group, and a whole series of other important NGOs are either have a headquarters in Brussels or they're moving with some major presence in Brussels. Then the large international organizations like the EU and NATO. I think that's an important consideration, a critical mass of international organizations. Mass media, these things build on each other. And so Brussels is already emerging as a major global political city. If I had to point to, I think except for Washington. Interestingly, it contrasts quite a bit to Paris. And here's where I think we can see the importance not of government strategy, not of the bureaucrats and the formal side of policymaking, but of the NGOs or of the mass media or the think tanks or the universities. The broader non-governmental side can be really very dynamic. And that, I think, is a driving force in the world because those entities are becoming, in my mind, more and more important. The foreign policies of Putin or years ago, of course, de Gaulle and so on, notwithstanding, the narrower government-driven, government-centric cities they step in some ways on the very potential of a broader sort of freer kind of community would have. In that regard, a major question, I think, is what the future of Beijing as a global political city will be. And certainly there have been some very important, and I think in some ways, more far-sighted elements of the Beijing non-governmental scene than sometimes we realize. The Ford Foundation, for example, has been very active in Beijing, and a lot of the more economic organizations and so on, or energy-related organizations. But will the state step on the potential that could otherwise be extremely dynamic of a city in a nation like China, which is rising in geopolitical importance so clearly? Conversely, what will happen to New Delhi? To me, that's another interesting question. Certainly, India's global role. I was in New Delhi last week, and quite impressed with some of the think tanks and with the vibrant kind of debate which is going on in India. And as India's role in world affairs rises, and this non-governmental side also becomes more important, isn't New Delhi going to rise as a more important city? And of course, another one that a couple that we would certainly think to inside China, Shanghai. Will Shanghai in some ways outshadow Beijing? Or maybe the Chinese themselves even would like to see that, because a dynamic, more freewheeling sort of center might disturb the policy process, they might feel. And maybe having this at arm's length down in Shanghai, groups like the Shanghai Institute of International Affairs that's quite influential, that would be more attractive for China. Tokyo. What will happen to Tokyo? Of course, I've long thought Japan has an important global role and hasn't played probably on the non-governmental side the kind of role which it potentially could. How will Tokyo evolve? And then, of course, other centers. It doesn't have to be just in East Asia and in Europe, but I think those are probably the ones that might evolve first. Istanbul or Ankara? Would it be Ankara as a governmental center? Would it be Istanbul, of course, the non-governmental? I tend to think it could well be Istanbul. Could Istanbul play a significant role as a global political city in the Islamic world? So there's a lot of interesting possibilities, but I do think that global political cities are something that we have to understand better, not just Washington, but some of these other emerging ones that you're alluding to. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.